Welcome to this video with the provocative title, Is the .65 Wrong About VFR in IMC Situations? For the record, I'm filming this on January 19th of 2021. You're very smart, so let's just cut to the chase. I wouldn't put out a title like this unless clearly, in my opinion, the 7110.65 was wrong about the guidance given to controllers about how we should be responding to VFR in IMC kinds of situations. In this particular video, I am not per se going to be making positive suggestions about how I think it should be improved. Some of those kinds of suggestions will be implicit in my criticism, but this particular video, what I will be focusing on, frankly, is criticizing the guidance that's currently in the 7110.65. It's the same guidance we've had for a long time. So let's get started. To do that, the very first thing I want to do is kind of opine on a little bit of a debate that's gone on for a number of years, and that is the concept of 178 seconds to live. In fact, if you go type in your favorite search engine 178 sec, before you get done, it's going to autocomplete and say 178 seconds to live. It's a fairly well-known concept. It has generated some debate, and I want to give you my opinion on how valid I think that concept is. To kind of get our heads around that before I give you my opinion, I want to start by looking at a video that AOPA's Air Safety Foundation, now the AOPA Air Safety Institute, put out back in 2009. Let's watch that video.
The sky is overcast and the visibility poor. That reported 5-mile visibility looks more like 2, and you can't judge the height of the overcast. Your altimeter says you're at 1,500 feet, but your chart tells you there's terrain in the area as high as 1,200 feet. Still, you've flown through weather like this before, so you press on. You find yourself easing back slightly on the controls to give yourself more clearance. Then, with no warning, you're in the soup. You peer so hard into the mist that your eyes hurt. You swallow, only to find your mouth dry. Somewhere a voice is saying, you should have turned back. You now have 178 seconds to live. You push the rudder and add a little pressure on the controls to stop the turn. But this feels unnatural, and you return the controls to their original position. This feels better, but now your compass is turning a little faster, and your airspeed is increasing. You scan the panel for help, but you don't find any. It doesn't make any sense. You're sure you'll break out in a few minutes, but you don't have a few minutes. You now have 100 seconds to live. You glance at your altimeter and are shocked to see it unwinding. You're already down to 1,200 feet. Instinctively, you pull back on the controls, but the altimeter still unwinds. The tack is in the red, and the airspeed's almost there too. You now have 45 seconds to live. Now you're sweating and shaking. There must be something wrong with the controls. Pulling back only moves the airspeed deeper into the red. You can hear the wind tearing at the airplane. You have 10 seconds to live. You see the ground. The trees rush up at you. You can see the horizon if you turn your head far enough, but it's at a strange angle. You open your mouth to scream.
Well, that dropped into the aviation community back in 2009. It generated a little bit of controversy, kind of reignited the discussion about this concept of 178 seconds to live. Partly in response to some of the controversy about that video, the executive director of the Air Safety Foundation, named Bruce Landsberg, put out a blog entry in 2010. We'll look at that in a second. For what it's worth, I'll note that he later became one of the Archie League judges for a while, and Bruce is currently, as of the date I'm filming this, the vice chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. But back in 2010, here was his blog entry about this. And actually, I've got it queued up here, so let me bring it up this way. Okay. He says, basically, periodically, we get on one of these doom and gloom kicks when something nasty happens that shouldn't have. He talks about some of the statistics. And 2009 was actually relatively good, but earlier in the decade of the 2000s, the average had been about 30 mishaps per year, most of which were fatal. In other words, we had a fatality from a VFR and IMC about once every other week. Now, to be clear, not all of them were talking to controllers, but my goal in this discussion is to figure out ways so that controllers controllers can best improve the odds of survival for all of these people who do talk to us. Now, one of the things that he talks about in this blog entry, he says some of the really old timers out there may remember this Scare 'em Straight video, came straight from a study that AOPA funded through the University of Illinois way back in the dark ages in 1954. It took the average VFR pilot less than 3 minutes to lose control in IMC and crash. Just less than 3 minutes is where that 178 seconds concepts comes in. Many didn't even make it to the 2-minute mark. And by the way, there's been a little bit of a controversy about whether this is too scary. So this is an unscientific survey down here. A couple people thought it was too much for a new pilot. A couple people thought that new pilots really need to see this. Almost everybody said that all pilots should see this. So that's a non-scientific survey and so on. About 6 years later, there was an article published in AOPA Pilot Magazine. And this was not Bruce's work here, but let me kind of run through this article a little bit. So some things never change, it seems. Take unintended flights from visual flight rules into instrument conditions, the VFR into IMC. While these accidents represent a small number of the total crashes every year, they consistently represent a disproportionate percentage of the fatalities. And it's been true for so long that way back in 1954, the AOPA Foundation, as it was known then, was so concerned about the problem that it funded this University of Illinois study. Now, here's what they did. You're welcome to find this article and read through it on your own. They put VFR pilots in a simulator for a Bonanza, put them into IMC conditions and so on, and then look at how they all fared. So they took 20 volunteer, non-instrument rated pilots, put them in these conditions, recorded the results. Every single one of the study's participants, without fail, went into a graveyard spiral or a whip stall attitude. A whip stall is basically just an accelerated stall almost immediately after entering IMC. The shortest time to loss of control was 20 seconds. The longest was 480. The average was 178 seconds. Thus was born the 178 seconds to live legend. Let me pause on that and just talk about the very simple math here. The 178 seconds is an average. Okay. Now, if you think about averages in a study like this, imagine, for the sake of discussion, and this isn't quite what happened, imagine that 19 of the 20 all end up, crashing within 20 to 30 seconds, and then you get one person who manages to fly the thing for 10 or 15 minutes before they crash, right? Well, the average might mathematically be 178, but essentially, virtually everybody loses control in 20 to 30 seconds. There were a couple of high numbers that kind of skewed the average, and so at first glance, I'm actually not really on board with this idea of 178 seconds to live. I think it's much, much shorter than that, in part because even for those who did fine for a while, they might have initially done fine, but then once they started to lose kind of their awareness, they got into some spatial disorientation, about 20 to 30 seconds after that is when they crashed and so on. For what it's worth, the study had been done back in 1954. It kind of disappeared for about 4 decades. It rose to prominence again, and so on. You had the FAA bring it up in 1993. Transport Canada back in 2003 talked about it. It got attention in other places. In 2009, the story got new life when the AOPA Air Safety Institute made the dramatic video I showed you a couple of minutes ago. Some even just called it a Scare 'em Straight video and so on. And the blog asked readers to vote. That's the blog we were looking at a couple of minutes ago. Opinions were mixed, but one thing is certain. The video went viral, as did its written counterpart. Now, they're going to go on and talk about in this article here about some other stuff that I'm going to skip for the sake of time. But let me go back to this. So here's my opinion. There's 178 seconds to live. 30 seconds to live is the way we should be approaching this. And I'm going to defend this in a minute. Before I do, in some detail, I want to first take an initial glance at the .65 guidance, just so you see what's there, just by way of refresher, and then we will kind of go back and circle back a little bit later and talk about it in some detail. Now, to do that, let me go to the .65. This is the current new version, the 7110.65 Yankee through change 3. And yes, I've got a lot of colors up here. It'll make sense to you in a minute. But let's just get our heads around the 3 sections in Chapter 10 that deal with VFR and IMC kind of situations. So 10-2-7 is about VFR aircraft and weather difficulty, 10-2-8 radar assistance to VFR aircraft and weather difficulty, and then 10-2-9 radar assistance techniques. I'd like you to imagine that you are a developmental who's sitting down with the .65 kind of for the first time, and you really want to do the best job possible. You don't want to just pass the written test or something. You want to really understand and kind of get your head around this. So you're going to start to look at this. So first of all, just the paragraph title. So first of all, 10-2-7 is kind of a generic one. 10-2-8, because it's about radar assistance, might imply that this is only dealing with if we are going to have radar coverage on the airplane, and it doesn't maybe apply if we're not going to have radar coverage on somebody. And then assuming we have radar coverage and we're going to provide assistance, then 10-2-9 is one of the techniques. One detailed thing I will note before we move on is this. So first of all, we're just going to simplify this in part. See the three sections I've highlighted in gray? They are identical word for word in all three of these sections. It's as if we got kind of stupid and decided there was something that we missed, and so we better put it in all three places just so controllers get it. So at the end of 10-2-7, VFR aircraft and weather difficulty, okay, it says the following must be accomplished on a Mode C equipped VFR aircraft that no longer requires the 7700 code, and it has to do with giving them a discrete beacon code so that the MSAW processing can work properly. Well, why put that there and there and there? Just put it once and be done with it. Now, that doesn't make this wrong per se. It just means that it kind of gives you the impression that this maybe wasn't well written. And besides, what is it doing in 10-2-7 anyway? We haven't even gotten to the radar assistance part. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to right click, I'm just going to redact it and get rid of it. So we just chunked off a bit of 10-2-7, and really there's just one part of 10-2-7. If you want to put it in one of the three places, I'm fine with leaving it here in 10-2-8, but there's no need to repeat it down there. So you're welcome. We just got rid of two sections of the .65. I'm sure the lawyers are contacting my lawyers any minute now. Okay, but let's be a little bit more serious here. So those are the three sections in the 7110.65. Let's get into a small detailed look about three incidents. I know I only have two up there. So first I want to begin with the fatal crash, 4 people killed, in the Cirrus SR-20 November 223 Charlie Delta near Chicago. And I want to start by looking at an AOPA accident case study video that was put out a few years ago. We are not going to look at the whole thing, but let's just kind of get our heads around what has gone on. And part of the reason I bring up the AOPA accident case study video, which has had more than 1.5 million views and is routinely used in pilot seminars in different locations, is because this accident has got a lot of attention. And yet I'm going to argue in a minute there is something that I think everybody has missed. In full confession, I missed it initially. Okay, so let me give you kind of the backstory. You're of course welcome to watch this on your own, and I encourage you to. This was a Cirrus SR-20. Pilot took off from Marion, Indiana, was heading up towards the Chicago area, intending to drop off one of his adult daughters who was going to be going to college and so on. So he presents, and I'm just kind of parking it here and so on. He ends up kind of stumbling over DuPage Airport. He kind of blundered into their airspace, and actually let me bring it up right here as a pause. So he ends up calling DuPage Tower, and I'm going to paraphrase, and he says, "Oops, Tower, sorry, I've blundered into your airspace." And they're like, "All right, what can we do to help?" And he says, "Ooh, I see the runway right there. It's off my 1 o'clock in a mile or so." And they say, "You see the runways right now?" "Yep." "Okay, clear to land." The guy says, "Okay, cool, clear to land. By the way, fantastic job by the controller. I know, it's tempting to do some other things, but great start, right?" However, having said that, once the guy starts to maneuver, he goes back. He's kind of going to end up in and out of the clouds for a while, so he loses sight of it, and it kind of begins from there. Make a long story short, and again, you're welcome to go through this on your own, but he kind of circles around for a while. They give him to approach. The plan is to send him up to Palwaukee, aka Chicago Executive, okay, for a while, because the weather is a little bit better up there. And so he kind of gets vectored around for really the better part of about a half hour. And we're going to pick up here and watch just a little bit. At the point where I've kind of picking it up here, a Chicago approach is giving this altitude to somebody else. Let's watch just a moment.
Negative 223 Charlie Delta. That altitude was not for you, sir. Maintain VFR.
A few minutes later, The pilot tells the approach controller that he's changed his mind about landing at Pewaukee.
Cirrus 223 Charlie Delta, executive ATIS information. Victor is current. And let me know when you can navigate direct, and would you like flight following?
At this point, I don't want to mess with the weather. I'm going to get out. I don't want to get stuck in here.
Cirrus 223 Charlie Delta. Okay, so you're no longer inbound to executive?
No, we've navigated out of your airspace.
Cirrus 223 Charlie Delta, frequency change is approved.
Roger, 223 Charlie Delta.
I'm going to pause for a second and then talk about the thing that I think virtually everybody else, or perhaps everybody else, has missed. And here's what it is. You know, we sit down to watch an AOP accident case video. You know before you go in that this is going to end in an accident, or they wouldn't have made the video, right? Okay, you've seen this before. You've talked to your friends. You're at Oshkosh Air Show. Somebody says, hey, you got to come see this if you haven't seen it before, because it's got valuable lessons for VFR and IMC. You watch a guy who gets into this situation. He's VFR and IMC, and he ends up dead. And you go, okay, well, I need to avoid that. I need to get better weather briefings and so on. I need to call ATC earlier, and that's all part of the antidote and so on. But here's the question I want to ask. To get your head around this, let's go to the NTSB final report, because there's an interesting little detail that's staring us in plain sight that everybody missed. So this is going to talk about what happens and so on. Here's a radar plot of the end of the flight, okay, for the sake of time reference that we will come back to in a minute. Here is the DuPage Tower communications. The one thing I want to note from DuPage Tower is when this begins. It picks up at 09:58, so essentially 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. And for our purposes right now, that's the one and only thing I want to note, is just the time that this starts. Okay, there's a separate transcript communications from Chicago Approach Control, and the only thing, again, there's a lot of stuff here, but the one and only thing I want to focus on is the time when the pilot elected that, okay, he's no longer going to go to executive, and so Approach says, all right, frequency change approved. Now, for about 20 or 30 seconds, the pilot doesn't acknowledge, and so Approach repeats, and Cirrus 223 Charlie Delta, frequency change is approved. Couple seconds later, okay, Roger, 223 Charlie Delta. Note the time, 10:24. Note the time, 9:58. This whole thing takes course over about half an hour, just a little bit less than half an hour. And for all the risk and for all the fact that we know that this ends in a fatal accident, at some level, this guy has safely, quote-unquote, been operating in and out of the clouds for about a half an hour while talking to ATC. But let's go back to the timing on this. 10:24:23. Burn that in your brain for a second. That is when he Rogers the frequency change. Let's go back to the radar plot. 10:24:23. Right here. About 90 seconds later, he's dead in a right-hand turn, a graveyard spiral from low altitude where he impacted the ground.
By the time of this last exchange, the pilot has turned left to a westerly heading, possibly to continue the search for a VFR field, possibly in preparation to head home. A minute later, he begins another turn, this time to the right. The turn becomes a descending spiral, which continues until radar contact is lost at roughly 900 feet AGL. On the ground, witnesses report hearing what sounds like an airplane doing aerobatics. Seconds later, the doomed Cirrus emerges from the cloud bottoms in a 70-degree dive. As the onlookers watch helplessly, it plunges to the ground and disintegrates.
How is it that we talk to a pilot for about 30 minutes, and at the end of it, the pilot says, you know what, I'm going to get out of this Chicago area with the bad weather that it happens to be having today, so I'm going to go somewhere else. I think he was probably going back to Marion, Indiana. Maybe he was going out somewhere west or southwest to find VFR weather. But, the pilot, after 30 minutes of this, is like, you know what, I'm going to leave, so thanks for your help. And Approach does what every other approach controller or any air traffic control would ever say. It's like, okay, frequency change approved. Have a good day, Sorry we couldn't get you into where we were trying to get you. And 90 seconds later, he dies in a right-hand turn. Now, what in the world difference does it make about which direction he turned? We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay. The other incident that I had on the PowerPoint slide is the crash that has also gotten a fair amount of public attention of Columbia November 610 Mike Hotel near Islip, New York. Now, there is no video like that for this, so we're going to go back to our PDFs. We're going to start with the NTSB final report. This was in 2014, Columbia 400. The non-instrument rated pilot contacted flight service to get a briefing for his 15 nautical mile flight for about an hour later. And hey, it's VFR where you are. It's VFR at your destination airport where you just dropping the airplane off about 15 miles away. Okay, cool. Sounds all good. Now, for whatever reason, he was delayed for a couple of hours, and so he goes about 3 hours later. Now, that's part of the way this is presented to the pilot community is that this pilot launched. He goes off from Farmingdale over to Islip, just 15 nautical miles away. He shows up at Islip and it's IFR. And so pilots, don't forget to get a briefing before you go, even if you're delayed and you got a briefing earlier. But at some level you can kind of sympathize with this pilot. He did get a briefing earlier. It's only 15 miles. You'd be a little bit surprised. And that's kind of the backstory. So anyway, this guy launches. Farmingdale is still VFR. Islip is now IMC. Okay, over there on Long Island. And so about 10 minutes after takeoff, he gets into the controlled airspace of the destination airport. He contacts ATC and he says, I need your help. Okay, so controller begins to talk to the pilot a little bit. The pilot says, I don't have any visibility. Controller asks the pilot, are you declaring an emergency? Again, a very prudent thing for us to do. The controller is acting in accordance with the 7110.65. Okay, are you declaring an emergency because the destination airport of Islip is IMC? And the pilot does not respond. And then the pilot, a moment later, says, you know what? I'm going to go back to my departure airport. And so the controller does what every single controller would do. He says, Roger, squawk VFR. We're looking at the ATC transcript, and I think you know where I'm going with this. We're going to look at the timing. Okay, so where are you going? Heading to Islip, I just don't have visibility. Okay, are you declaring an emergency? Because Islip's IFR. 40 seconds go by. Zero Mike Hotel. I'm going to go back to FRG. All right. And then this controller does exactly what any of us would have done. Thank you. Sounds like a good plan. Squawk VFR and frequency change approved. Okay, squawk VFR, zero Mike Ho, and then it drops off as he's apparently getting ready to say hotel. Note the time. 13:01:54. Here's zoomed in. 13:01:54 puts him right here, and about 90 seconds later, in a tight descending right spiral, he's dead. Now, is that just sheer coincidence, or is there a pattern here? I'm going to argue that there is a pattern. I will give you another example in a minute. Let me explain what I think is going on. And I say think. I'm darn near convinced. I can't prove it, so that's why I use the word think rather than certain. But to illustrate what I want to do, I want to jump in the cockpit, and I know this is a different airplane than either of those two. One was a Cirrus, one was a Columbia 400. This is an analog gauge 172, and for what it's worth, we're sitting on the ground in beautiful Klamath Falls, Oregon at Crater Lake Airport, and so on. Okay, now we're just going to stand on the ground. We're not going to go flying, but the point I want to make is best illustrated by just sitting here and so on, and to kind of simulate in a way that we're restricted visibility, we're sort of in the soup. I'm just going to do Control-1 on the keyboard here, kind of zoom in on the instrument panel. That way we can't see outside. So I want you to imagine that, I know we're sitting on the ground here, but I want you to imagine that we're up flying, and we're looking at the instruments, trying to keep straight and level right now as we're talking to ATC and so on. Okay, and that we've had this conversation either just for a minute there in New York or for 30 minutes in the Chicago area, and it's like, you know what, I'm just going to go back to, wherever, and the controller says something like, Roger, squawk VFR, frequency change approved, have a good day. All right, here's what happens. This is, in effect, what I'm using to kind of show the view that the pilot has when they're on the instruments, and suddenly it's changed to a different frequency, squawk a new code, and play with your GPS and watch what happens to where the head goes and where the eyes go. Right over there. And then they start pushing buttons. Okay, so they start pushing, I'm just pushing random buttons here, okay, or they squawk 1200. There's a VFR button over there. You can't quite maybe see it right there. They go to change the frequency, so they got to start turning knobs and looking at the digits over here. Make sure, oops, I went too far. I got to go back to 29.0. Okay, then you got to flip-flop it. Meantime, they're going to go back to Farmingdale. So let's see. So direct, okay, push cursor, And let's see, let me go to Kilo. And meantime, they're looking right the whole time. Well, I go back to Kilo, Foxtrot. Okay. And while they're doing this, with their head over to the right and their attention over there to the right, what's the airplane doing? Because we told them to squawk a VFR code, change advisory frequency, and we hope you have a good day going back towards beautiful VFR, their head is over here to the right the whole time. And in the meantime, what the airplane's doing is that. And that's the disconnect between the 30 seconds to live and what the pilots are doing up in the cockpit. And that's why one of the things I want to do with the .65 is change the way it asks us whether we want to have the pilot declare an emergency and what we should be doing before we release the pilot. Now, in both of these two cases, 223 Charlie Delta and 610 Mike Hotel, the controller basically said, changed advisory frequency, just 90 seconds or so before they were dead. Now, I'm going to tell you another story. I do not have documentation for this. You will have to take my word for this. So the spring 2019 round of recurrent training about emergencies, I'm not going to go into details, but I had a heavy hand in helping develop that content. One of the parts of that, I recommended that for VFR and IMC situations, we just first concentrate on having as step one pilots level their wings. I'm not going to go beyond that at the moment. Well, a few months ago, there was a save, we'll just describe it out in the western part of the NAS, where there was a VFR-only pilot who was flying along. He expected it to be VFR, but for those of you who remember what it was like out in the western U.S. this past summer of 2020, there were a lot of forest fires and things. There was a lot of smoke. I've got some friends in Portland who talked about having to wear masks all the time. Anyway, this guy's flying up kind of in that Pacific Northwest region, and he got into such heavy smoke at altitude that he was effectively IMC. And he ended up flying well for a while the controllers were providing some basic help, but then at one point he got into a right-hand graveyard spiral, and the controller talking to the airplane remembered the advice given in the recurrent training, reminded him to level the wings. He leveled the wings, he recovered from the graveyard spiral, and the reason I'm telling you this story is because the controller was kind enough to thank the recurrent training team for providing that advice that might have saved that pilot's life. The recurrent training team in turn, one member of it, was kind enough to quietly contact me and say, hey, Dean, just so you know, your material may have saved somebody's life. Now, I'm not here to claim credit for that. That is absolutely not my point. My point is, because of that, I was able to view a Falcon replay of the thing, and I looked at it, and indeed it turned out that way. But what caught my eye was the fact that this guy had flown essentially IMC for a little while without too much trouble, but then he started the graveyard spiral, and I specifically looked at what we as controllers had done just in that last minute or so before the graveyard spiral had begun. He was still IMC, and at that point the controllers got into a bit of an extended discussion about a couple of different airports, detailed reading of the METARs, and what do you want to do? And the pilot says, I think I'm going to go to, and then he mentioned one airport. And then I guarantee you what he's doing is he's heads down like this. He's punching something into his GPS, and this guy who'd been flying along for 10 or 12 minutes or so suddenly gets into a graveyard spiral. And while we, at some level, maybe we get credit for recognizing the graveyard spiral and saying, just level your wings, and the guy got out of it, arguably, this guy who'd been able to manage for a little while, once he went head down, starts a right-hand graveyard spiral because he's punching stuff in. We've got to be aware of that. And so that's why, and by the way, I found this in other incidents as well. I'm going to kind of come back to this. I'll leave you with kind of those three examples. Like I say, the third one I confess I don't have documentation for as we speak. But here's where I'm going with this. Let's go back to the .65 and get into a little bit of a detailed discussion about the .65. So first of all, I got to figure out which window I'm in. All right, so the .65, we've already redacted a couple sections out of 10-2-7 and 10-2-9. You're welcome, no additional charge. Okay, so let's get our head around this. Again, I want you to picture you're developmental and you really want to make sure you understand this, not just, be able to pass the test at the end of the CBI or something, right? Okay, so 10-2-7. If a VFR aircraft requests assistance when it encounters or it's about to encounter IFR weather conditions, so I am particularly concerned with if they are already encountering weather conditions. Obviously, if somebody's about to encounter, then I really don't have a problem, but at that level, they are VMC at the moment it presents. So I'm really concerned with kind of the VFR in IMC when it first presents. So if somebody is already encountering IFR weather conditions, and that certainly happens. It happened in Chicago, it happened in DuPage, it happened out west this past summer. It says, point 65, determine the facility best able to provide service. If a frequency change is necessary, advise the pilot of the reason for the change and request the aircraft contact the appropriate control facility. So in effect, what this says is the very first thing we should do is have somebody change frequencies. Are we nuts? If we absolutely need to for some reason, then I would advocate, okay, just keep your wings level. Just, are you straight and level? Okay. All right. Then we're going to switch you to a different frequency and so on. But the idea that step one might be a frequency change, that's just nuts. And arguably, because I've already redacted this part here, because it's a repeat that really belongs maybe in 10-2-8, that's the one and only thing that's in 10-2-7, and I argue it's wrong. By all means do so, but not until we get an appropriate step one done at a minimum. Okay. Then let's go to 10-2-8, radar assistance to VFR aircraft in weather difficulty. Again, if a VFR aircraft requests radar assistance, so this implies that we're just dealing with radar assistance, and in effect, if you think about it, this and the other one, the stuff it's talking about here, this has nothing to do with whether they're radar contact. Let's just kind of focus on that for a second with 10-2-9. So let's talk about like E, avoid abrupt maneuvers. I've color-coded it green because I'm completely on board with that. That's fine, right? Avoid abrupt maneuvers. That's not about radar assistance. That's a general assistance technique. We don't want to do abrupt maneuvers whether we have them in radar contact or not radar contact. That's nothing to do with radar assistance. Okay, having said that, I'll get off that horse for a minute. So this basically says if somebody shows up VFR, okay, requesting assistance, and they're about to encounter, or specifically I'm concerned with if they have encountered, first of all, ask if they're qualified for and capable of conducting an RFR flight. Now, that's not per se wrong, but you know what? Especially if they've already encountered, I'm going to recommend to you to think about the idea that most instrument-rated pilots are going to explain that up front. They're going to do like I actually have, okay, on a flight where I was instrument rated. I was in an instrument capable airplane, and I got into a situation where it was going to be IFR up ahead. So what I did was I called the local ATC frequency, and I said, hey, I'm IFR equipped and qualified, and I've got some IMC coming up, so can I pick up a clearance? Now, if I had just called and said, I've got IFR up ahead, that seems like a stupid way to put it if you're qualified for and capable of, in that particular airplane, IFR flight. So I would argue that for us, unless the pilot pretty clearly states that they're capable and qualified and so on, if they don't say that up front, we should start with the presumption that they are not capable of, as far as the airplane goes, or are not personally qualified for IFR flight, and we should go from there. Again, step one, just keep your wings level, just keep it straight and level for the moment. That's step one, and then we'll go from there. And if we find out 30 seconds later the pilot's like, oh, I'm qualified for it, I'm capable, okay, well, then you know how to keep it straight and level. That was just irrelevant, but there's no downside, there's no risk to that, and so on. Okay, now, if they're qualified for it, capable, then we go a certain route. That's fine. I have no problem with that. And then C says, if the pilot states that he or she is not qualified for, or in a plane not capable of conducting IFR flight, or if for whatever reason they refuse an IFR flight, I'm not even sure. What does this mean if they refuse to file an IFR flight plan? You get an instrument-rated pilot in an instrument-qualified airplane. They actually get into the soup, and we're like, okay, well, let me give you an IFR clearance to, Islip or Pewaukee or wherever, right? And they go, no, I don't want an IFR clearance. Well, I'm not even really worried about that one, okay? But I'm more concerned with the VFR pilots who were in IMC. Now, so this says, so basically, if they're not qualified for, so this is a VFR pilot in IMC, it says, inform the pilots of airports where VFR conditions are reported, provide other available pertinent weather information, and ask if he or she will elect to conduct VFR flight to such an airport. So let's imagine this in the Long Island case with 610 Mike Hotel. Okay, so this guy shows up. Are you IFR equipped and qualified? Nope. Okay, well, 10 miles behind you back at Farmingdale, it's VFR. Okay, do you want to go VFR to Farmingdale? That's a good idea. Okay, squawk VFR, frequency change approved. Have a good day. And what are we doing? You know where I'm going with this. If only I was smart enough to go to the right window, which I'm not. That's what we would do if we follow the 0.65, okay? I'm not in favor of that. I mean, on paper, it looks like that seems reasonable, and clearly the goal is to get people to VFR conditions, but I wouldn't start there. And by the way, if the action in subparagraph 1, so if it's not feasible for this, okay, or if the pilot declines to conduct VFR flight, then provide radar assistance if the pilot declares an emergency, or refuses to declare, and you have determined the exact nature of the radar services the pilot desires. First of all, let me just pause right there and explain why I color-coded this red. Clearly, I'm objecting in color-coding it red. VFR and IMC, since the 1950s, has year after year after year been one of the biggest killers in general aviation airplanes. Why in the world is it not an automatic emergency? In my mind, a VFR in IMC is an automatic emergency. We can debate what the exact handling should be when we come up with an improved version of the 0.65, assuming we don't do that shortly after I get fired here for being rude about the problems that it has. But you know what? It's a mandatory emergency. Boom. End of story. We can cancel it if it seems like they're in VMC conditions, that they'll stay in VMC conditions, but this is just a mandatory emergency. I wouldn't even bother with this section right here the way it's worded. Okay. Then it says in 3, if the aircraft has already encountered IFR conditions, so you got a VFR and IMC situation, inform the pilot of the appropriate minimum altitude. If the aircraft is below, okay, and there's sufficiently accurate position information which has been received, or we have established radar identification, furnish a heading or radial on which to climb to reach appropriate terrain or obstacle clearance minimum altitude. Let's think about that one for a second. So first of all, furnish a heading or a radial. Now, the heading part is okay, but presumably in that case we are having them on either the current heading or we're turning them to a new heading, but also because they are below the altitude, we're having them climb. So now we're issuing a climb and a turn at the same time. So 10-2-9D says, avoid requiring a climb or a descent while in a turn if in IFR conditions. Arguably, 10-2-9D is in conflict with 10-2-8C3. So which is it? But it gets worse in C3 of 10-2-8, and here's why. So one of the things that the 0.65 says we might do is either a heading or a radial on which to climb. Can you picture what's involved with giving somebody a radial? Okay, I've got you in radar contact. Fly your current heading, intercept the such and such 054 radial, proceed inbound while climbing because you're in mountainous terrain or whatever, right? How are they going to do that? Well, they're going to have to come over here. They're going to have to switch this. They're going to have to dial up whatever, VOR frequency they're going to dial up. They're going to have to flip-flop it. Then they got to come down here. Okay, then they got to do this, and they got to make sure that they've got this set on nav, not GPS, and they got to dial up the, I don't even remember what I said, I think the 054 radio. So they got to dial that up. Meantime, they're maybe trying to get a climb going. They're flying their current heading until they intercept, and then they got to make it. We're heads down pushing buttons. In any case, just think about this for a second. If a VFR and IMC pilot shows up and they're below the appropriate minimum altitude, I'm on board with informing them of what that altitude is, okay? But first of all, we have to decide whether a climb is good or not. It is not necessarily good, but even if assuming that we're going to climb them, in almost all cases, just climb on your current heading. If you have to also turn because it's an area where at the moment they're fine, but up ahead it's higher terrain, or there's some 2,000 foot tall antenna farm or something, then we issue a turn as well or something. But under any normal circumstance, issuing a radial on which to climb is just downright dangerous. By the way, I'm fine with keeping D here about the 7700 code if we want, but again, getting rid of it in 10-2-9. Okay, 10-2-9. I am basically on board with this. You'll see I've color-coded most of it, either kind of a green or a light green or something. So let's talk about this. So it says, use the following techniques to the extent possible when you provide radar assistance. Again, it's not about radar assistance. This is whether we're providing assistance, not radar assistance. But so when you provide assistance to a pilot who's not qualified to operate in IFR conditions. By the way, this is talking about a pilot who's not qualified. What if you have the qualified pilot who's not in a capable airplane? Well, does this apply or not? That's just poorly worded, doesn't really affect anything. But anyway, A, avoid frequency changes except when necessary to provide a clear communications channel. What if they're going to fly out of my radio coverage area, or there's some other reason to change it? So, I mean, the principle is avoid frequency changes, which, by the way, remember, after redacting this, the only thing we have left is a frequency change. So really, 10-2-9A is basically in opposition to what remains of 10-2-7. Okay. But anyway, and it's not necessarily about providing a clear communication channel. If I need a clear communication channel with this pilot, I'm probably moving everybody else off and keep this airplane here if I can. I don't want them changing frequencies. If we do have to change frequency for whatever reason, just verify they're straight and level, that they're not immediately headed towards a mountain or something like that. Okay, make sure they stay straight and level, and they just carefully change to whatever that next frequency is, and that's fine. So just use caution and some common sense when you do that. Let's skip down just to E and F real quick because they're color-coded green. So E, avoid abrupt maneuvers. I talked about that already. That's pretty obvious. F is really the goal, vector aircraft to VFR conditions if we can. That's not always possible, so that's a noteworthy or a noble goal, shall we say. And then let's just talk about B and C. I've color-coded these kind of a light green because just the way they're written, it's slightly awkward. It says B, make turns while the aircraft is in VFR conditions, so it will be in a position to fly a straight course while in IFR conditions. And C says have pilot lower gear and slow aircraft to approach speed while in VFR conditions. So what I want to harp on in these two is it's in VFR conditions, in VFR conditions. Well, yeah, I like doing that and so on, but here's the problem. The problem is we're dealing with a VFR pilot who's in IMC. What do we do if they kind of are stuck in IMC and maybe they're not in and out of the clouds? I kind of get that, like, hey, okay, so you're in and out of the clouds? Yeah, okay. Just stay on your current heading, just straight and level. If you break out of the clouds for a moment, then we're going to turn you 30 left or something like that, and we're going to have you put the gear and slow down to some approach speed or whatever at that point. But what happens if they never break out of the clouds? Do we never slow them down? What's the timing on that and so on? Can we have them put the gear down right away? And as far as turns, if they're IMC, then how do we do the turns and so on? So I know it says use the following techniques to the extent possible. And so I guess that covers it. And so these are kind of more ideals. So I'm basically on board with this. They're just, to my mind, a little poorly worded. But then this one's blue. It's not red because I'm not objecting to it. But here's D. And my take on this is going to surprise you, no matter who you are, because even the experts, and the way I used to think for forever, we were all on board with this. All the experts are currently on board with this. It says avoid requiring a climb or descent while in a turn if in IFR conditions. Now, as I already mentioned, in effect, that's already in conflict with 10-2-8C3. But having said that, let me also take you to the Airplane Flying Handbook real quick, and just a couple of sentences here from Chapter 17 about emergency procedures, specifically inadvertent VFR flight into IMC. And while we want to be a little bit cognizant of what it says about turns, climbs, descents, for the moment I want to focus on the combined maneuvers, because the combined maneuvers is when you're combining a turn with either a climb or a descent. And so the language here, after talking about turns, climbs, descents, it says combined maneuvers. Combined maneuvers such as climbing or descending turns should be avoided if at all possible by an untrained instrument pilot already under the stress of an emergency situation. By the way, that's what everybody believes today. It's what I believed for a long time. And it says combining maneuvers only compound the problems encountered in individual maneuvers and increase the risk of control loss. Remember, the objective is to maintain airplane control by deviating as little as possible from straight and level flight attitude, and thereby maintaining as much of the airplane's natural equilibrium as possible. So, why am I out completely on a limb all by myself and somehow objecting to this wonderful advice that everybody and their mother and their brother and their step-uncle would endorse? Okay, so I'm just going to note that it's also here in the Airplane Flying Handbook, but we're going to come back to the point 65. What in the world could be my stupid suggestion about what's wrong with this? Here's what it is. First of all, let me put it to you this way. Suppose that at some point we have somebody who is in one of these situations, they're low on fuel, and we're going to have them start a descent, and so while descending, we also want to turn them, right now they're northbound, they're heading towards some higher terrain, so we also want to turn them to the west. So they've already got just a gentle descent going. They're descending at, 200, 300, 500 feet a minute and so on. Okay, while they're descending, can we have them make a turn? There's nothing inherently dangerous about that. That's not per se a combined maneuver. And in fact, here's the thing. If you're saying, no, Dean, we can't combine maneuvers, so we got to have them level off. So maybe they're going to level it at 4,000 feet. So they're level at 4,000 feet, and then we're going to have them make the turn. Here's what you're doing. And I'm going to kind of jump back into just the static version of the flight simulator here and jump back in. So here at Klamath Falls, we're at 4,100 feet. Let's just call it 4,000 feet, ignore where we are, and just assume that we're in an area of lower terrain and we're not flying 100 feet underground. So I'm just going to use the calibration knob in the Colesman window to kind of pretend that we're at 4,000 feet and we're on this heading here. I'm just going to set the heading bug for the heading that we're on right now, about a 340. Okay. Now, what we don't want to do is combine like specifics. Okay, turn left heading 300 to center maintain 3,500. And the reason is because now the pilot is chasing two targets. Okay, so 3,500. So while the altimeter is kind of working its way down, okay, the heading indicator is kind of working over towards that 300, and they're chasing this one. At the same time, they're chasing this one. Okay, the vertical speed's moving around. They got the attitude indicator. The airspeed's maybe moving around. The turn coordinator showing a turn to the left. They're kind of working their way down. And what happens is we're overwhelming the pilot by giving them two targets. But the issue here is that we have like a specific target altitude in mind, and that is the vertical thing that is causing all of the attention being drawn over here, while they also have a specific target over here as they're trying to roll out on maybe that 300 heading. Okay, to have two targets at once is what is actually going to overload the pilot in this situation. Just suppose, for the sake of discussion, I'll kind of bring it back up here, and I'll just leave this on the 300 heading, that for whatever reason we're just getting them descending. They're going to be descending down to 2,000-ish feet, get below the clouds. And so while they're descending, and they just have a nice gentle descent going, they're maybe doing 300, 400 feet a minute-ish or something, and while descending, can they make a turn over to a 270 heading, just trying to get towards the area of lower terrain and better weather? Yeah, this thing is descending. This is all nice and stable. You can kind of let this go and just focus on this. Now let's say they get on the 270 heading, and while they're on the 270 heading, and we don't mind it moving around a little bit, so maybe they're not going perfectly straight and they're not holding perfectly wings level, and so the heading kind of wanders back to the right a little bit or off to the left a little bit, and we can let that wander while they're descending down to some target altitude of saying 3,000 feet, because we're not sure if they're going to break out by the time they get to 3,000 feet. So we want to stop them at that particular altitude. Okay, this can wander around a little bit while they just basically keep this nice and straight as far as wings level, but it doesn't matter if they're not perfectly straight. They just give them one target at a time, and I'll just kind of start with this. If we tell them, okay, maintain the 3,000, because we don't want to do a climb or descent, while we turn to a heading of 300, now what happens is we think, okay, we're not doing combined maneuvers. We're keeping this at one spot while we're just adjusting one thing. So now they're kind of doing the turn, but they're also having to check this. And if they start to climb a little bit, all of a sudden they now have a second target, and they're, I got to get back down. So now they're doing the turn, and they're getting, I got to focus on getting back down. And meantime, what can happen, because we're giving them two targets at the moment, and maybe they kind of come up here and they're focusing, I'm a little bit high, I got to work my way back down. Suddenly the bank gets away from them and they get into a graveyard spiral. So I am not a fan of saying that we need to have two targets at once. We want to let, to the extent we can, one or the other kind of slide around a little bit. So the altitude doesn't have to be held perfectly. As long as they're not going to hit anything imminently, if they're at some altitude and they start descending or climbing a little bit, just let it go. Okay, don't let it get crazy, but just keep it nice and something gentle while they work on this. And if we're going to change this, then just keep them basically straight. And if the heading wanders around a little bit, that's not a problem. Because strictly speaking, we already talked about C3 as a combined maneuver, as it were. What if we have somebody who's descending on something like an emergency approach? The whole idea is you just get a nice stable descent going, and then as long as it's basically a stable descent, somebody's descending for an approach and then they're 10 degrees off heading. What do? Do we, stop your descent because we don't want to combine maneuvers, so you got to stop your descent. Okay, make sure you level off. Okay, now make the 10-degree correction. Okay, now start your descent again. Well, first of all, now we're going to interrupt the approach. So this thing here, actually, we want to, I'm perfectly on board with the idea of not combining maneuvers in principle, but what I actually think we want to have in mind is not combining two different specific targets. And with that, I'm going to kind of end with this. I do think that if and when the .65 section here gets rewritten, I think it should be a mandatory emergency in practically every case. Step one should just be level the wings, make sure you're more or less level in altitude, okay? And then we go from there. If they are too low, if there is some imminent threat, then we're going to have to address that and so on. Okay, in the meantime, I would also like it to be said that there's one thing I'd like to prohibit controllers from doing that I see controllers do. I've seen controllers who get somebody in this situation. So you get some VFR and IMC. Are you declaring an emergency? Do you want some help? Yep, I need help. I'm going to need vectors. Okay, and so the first thing the controller does is we say, Roger, and maybe they're 3,000 feet or so. Roger, maintain 3,000 and fly heading 060. And what's the very first thing we're doing? We're giving them two targets at once. And even though it's only one kind of maneuver per se, we're giving them two targets. And when this moves around a little bit, they're now chasing this. And we're actually combining maneuvers even when we think, no, we're just assigning them their current altitude. I argue this needs a rethink. I'm not prepared to explore that in full. I'm going to finish this off with one more quick video just to wrap it up. I'm calling this Canadian video. The Smart Pilot Canada YouTube channel put this out a few years ago. They took a bunch of pilots into a full motion general aviation simulator. A bunch of non-instrument rated pilots, exposed them to IMC conditions, and I want to watch about half, maybe 2/3 of the video.
Go bad so fast that you're not going to get out of it.
I thought it would be easier. It gets pretty hairy very quickly.
My heart rate was racing, even though I was in a machine.
You treat it as real. It's scary.
Many pilots are familiar with the 178 seconds to live scenario based upon research from the University of Illinois. The study found that 178 seconds was the average time it took for a VFR pilot to lose control of their aircraft in simulated instrument meteorological conditions. Smart Pilot wanted to test the 178 seconds to live premise, so we conducted our own experiment. 17 pilots were recruited. All had varied amounts of flight time, some into the thousands of hours, and all the volunteers had little or no instrument training. Using a Redbird simulator at Precise Pilot, each volunteer started out in low ceilings with a 5-mile visibility. Flying at an indicated 1,500 feet, the visibility continued to lower, and eventually all found themselves in instrument meteorological conditions.
Well, everything started off very, very well. I used a lot of my VFR training, was looking outside the window quite a bit, felt quite comfortable, and then as everything started to deteriorate, moved my eyes back inside and onto the instruments to make sure that I met the safe minimum altitudes. And then it was really to see if I could fly through it, if it was something that was quick to fly through. Once I realized that it wasn't, I started to execute a 180, where I had paid very close attention to the heading going in and the back course heading. All of a sudden in the turn, and now with turbulence and making sure that I was maintaining the aircraft, those numbers became blurred in my mind. And so I actually started flying in circles before I realized that I had missed my back course. So that would have set me up for even greater failure.
I am not used to scanning the instruments, so as soon as we go into the clouds, I'm obviously in trouble. You do the best you can. I didn't invert it, but virtually. I was such a steep bank that we would have flown into the ground. I was in such a steep turn, I couldn't bring it out of that.
Get low.
It's in the trees. Yeah, you want to try and level out?
I'm trying to. Wow, we're going to crash here, my friends.
The ground came before the plane corrected, which is unfortunate.
The reason why instrument flying is so hazardous to non-instrument rated pilots is because you have all these cues from your body. The G-forces are playing tricks on you. The idea is always rely on the instrument. They are the most reliable. Just maintain level flight with them. Do everything you can to stay out of the soup.
When pilots get into these situations, I argue that they don't have 178 seconds to live, which might be an average. I argue that they have 30 seconds to live unless we do things right. Trust your instruments, just basic, straight, and level. If there are other threats, we'll deal with those as well. Are you instrument rated and qualified? If yes, okay, fine. Then we'll go from there. If not, do not issue a heading and an altitude. Okay, if they are down low, certainly advise them of them being below the minimum altitude and ask if they want to climb, which might not be the best course depending on the nature of the clouds above them, particularly if they're laden with ice and so on. Okay, try to not have them push any buttons. Avoid frequency changes like the plague early on. Avoid any transponder changes early on. If they can guarantee that they're just going to stay straight and level and they do something real simple, especially an ident, maybe a code change, that's fine. If they can guarantee straight and level while they change frequencies, that's pretty straightforward. Avoid it if you can, but do it if you have to. Anything where they're programming and stuff and the GPS or dialing in VOR and a radial, oh my gosh, please do not do that. These people have 30 seconds to live if we don't do things right. I want to just pick up the very end of the video here. We'll start about there.
Saying one thing, the instrument saying something else, and of course you always try to believe the instrument, but I can see where you definitely need to have a lot of hood time or simulator time.
Smart Pilot's volunteer candidates had an across-the-board average of 267 seconds before either impacting terrain or experiencing what would equate to an in-flight failure. What they personally experienced reinforced the point that if you're not instrument qualified and the weather looks sketchy, eliminate the risk and wait it out.
For the pilots who don't wait it out and end up on our frequencies, I argue in good faith that the current wording of the 7110.65 is just flat wrong and needs a rethink. Thank you.